Thank you. Thanks, Kirsty. I'm Thomas Lee, and I'm stepping in temporarily for Amy Huffnagel, who's the Director of Programming here at the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center. And Jasmen Hunter is one of our fabulous educators. And we're delighted to be trying this new format, sharing with you a little bit of the experiences of the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center. And since it's a library program, we're really going to be talking about the book, the effect of the book, the history of the book, and the impact of the book. And the programs that we give here at the house, and I'd love to know how many of you have been, and if you haven't, we'd love to have you come and see us in person. But the programs that we give are very dialogic. We love to engage in real-time conversation with every guest. Every tour is different. Everybody interprets the house in a slightly different way. So it'll really share that if we hear from you tonight. Kirsty says that you're all very familiar with putting comments in the chat as we go along, and we're going to pause from time to time to sort of see what people are thinking. Questions are always welcome. We'd much rather know what you want to know than what we want to say. We listen to ourselves all the time. Jasmen, anything you want to add to that before we jump into our slides?
I think that was a great description of what we do here at the Stowe Center. It's not your typical tour, and this won't be your typical library talk. We really do want to hear from you. We do have all of this information about Harriet and Uncle Tom's Cabin, but really knowing what you would like to know about Harriet and the impact of her novel will be extremely helpful along the way. So any and all questions we welcome, we encourage. I'm Jasmen Hunter, as Thomas had mentioned. I am a visitor center coordinator here at the Stowe Center, and I do give tours to the entire public about what we're going to be talking about today. So really excited to hear from you and really excited to have this dialogue.
Okay, great. So I'm going to share my screen and off we go. So we're talking about making change. One of our mottos here is Harriet's words changed the world. And the novel certainly made ripples throughout the country as soon as it was published, and has continued to do so ever since. So, sure my, whoops. Not sure why that's not advancing. I thought oh, there we go. Okay. Now it'll probably jump ahead.
All right. Well, I'll just start by giving everyone some background on who we're talking about here. If you're not familiar, Harriet Beecher Stowe is the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin was the best-selling novel of the entire 19th century. So pretty big deal. It's only outsold by the Bible. It sells 300,000 copies in the US within the first year alone, and 1.5 million in the United Kingdom. So it skyrocketed right to the top of the bestsellers list almost immediately, and by now has been published in 75 languages. So quite incredible that Harriet could write this book that really did change the world. All she had was her pen. My favorite quote from her husband is, "My dear, it is written in God's great book that you are to be an author. You must therefore make all your calculations to spend the rest of your life with your pen." And that's exactly what she ends up doing. So I find it quite a fitting quote. And we can see right here on the screen exactly how much buzz Uncle Tom's Cabin was getting. I compare it to Harry Potter or Star Wars in the amount of merchandise, plays, screen adaptations that were created. And we're going to be diving a little bit deeper into that as well, and some of the unforeseen consequences of Uncle Tom's Cabin and the depictions of these characters. But Harriet writes Uncle Tom's Cabin serialized in the newspaper, similar to Charles Dickens, right? And so it's a really unconventional start for this worldwide best-selling novel.
You mentioned Harry Potter. I try to think of novels that have had the same kind of impact. When Thackeray visited America, he said, "You see it for sale at every train station. in every carriage, every third person is reading it, and every one of those people is in tears. Everyone in America, once it came out in its book form, everyone in America was reading about it, and they were talking about it. It sort of forced the conversation about enslavement. If you hadn't wanted to talk about it before, your neighbor was reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it was going to come up in polite conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And just to sort of orient you in terms of where Harriet lived, she was born in Litchfield, Connecticut. Her father, Lyman Beecher, was an old school Puritan from the Davenport group that separated from Boston in the 1600s. But he moved up to Litchfield, where he had a congregation. And then Harriet moved to Hartford when her sister Catherine opened a school here. Wherever Catherine was for more than 6 months, she would open a school for girls and teach them the same curriculum as boys at the time, which was quite radical. All the Beecher daughters, most of the Beecher daughters were quite forward thinking, and they were raised to make a difference in the world, all of them. And from Hartford, Harriet moved to Cincinnati, Ohio. And I love this geographical marker, because in the 1830s, when she moved there, it was the end of the line for the United States of America. America was making itself up as it went along. It was adding territories, adding states. And the question of which states would be free states and which states would honor enslavement was a very hot topic. And it was changing the political climate of the country. And a great deal happens in Harriet's time in Cincinnati, Ohio, but she doesn't actually begin to write the book until she moves to, of all places, Brunswick, Maine, where her husband is teaching. And that's where Uncle Tom was actually written. And then we also have Mandarin, Florida. Like every good New Englander, Harriet loved a winter home in the warm climate. And once she discovered Florida, she was there every winter for the rest of her life.
All right. Yeah, you may be wondering, you may not be wondering who some of these men are here on the screen. Well, to sort of piggyback right there off of what Thomas was saying, is when Harriet's moving to Cincinnati, Ohio, she was right there on the Ohio River. I don't know if Thomas, you just want to go back for a second, just so we can see right there that border of Cincinnati, Ohio, and Kentucky right below it. So Harriet is not far away from enslavement. In fact, she sort of is woken up to how intense slavery is in the South when she goes on just a small trip of Kentucky. And she sees a mother and her young son being separated, sold away from one another at the human auction block. And this really gets Harriet thinking a little bit more critically and emotionally about slavery. Up until this point, it really was an economic argument, a political argument. And all of a sudden, Harriet is catapulted into the emotional side of slavery, where we have families being torn from one another. And she's right there, right on that border. We got the Underground Railroad. We have the fugitive slave law that propels the Underground Railroad. So Harriet is right there in the center of the action, shall I say. And so that really opens her eyes. That's really what gets her to start thinking about anti-slavery in a way that maybe she could do something to change it.
I think a lot about Harriet being, from Connecticut, from New England, where slavery was, it had a long shadow. Her grandmother had owned slaves. People could still be enslaved when Harriet was a child. You had to sort of grow out of it. But it was other, the culture of enslavement was other for a young woman from Connecticut. And here, as Jasmine says, she's plonked, right at the edge of where slavery is happening.
But that being said, that's it. That's really the extent of her firsthand knowledge of slavery. And so we've included these two people and these two folks, particularly Josiah Henson, because Harriet needs somewhere to get her stories from. And she decides to go straight to the source. And in fact, has a sit-down interview with Josiah Henson, the man who famously will become Uncle Tom. Now that is, heavily debated. We do know she directly took part of Josiah's story and put that in Uncle Tom's Cabin. But in the end, Josiah ends up self-emancipating himself. He does escape north to Canada and eventually does get to freedom. So their stories do differ slightly. But Josiah Henson being that main inspiration, and not just Josiah Henson, we have hundreds, if not thousands, of enslaved narratives that Harriet is going to sort of get this firsthand account about slavery, so that the novel that she's writing, or short story as it was at the time, is as accurate as possible. Josiah Henson's house is now a museum, I believe his farm. I don't know if Thomas, you wanted to talk more about that as well, because now he's getting recognition for
Right,
being
it's wonderful, especially when we have folks from Canada visit the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center. Canadian children are learning more about Josiah Henson. You know, in after 1850, if you had been enslaved and you emancipated yourself, you were required by law, citizens were required by law to return enslaved people to their enslavers. We're just reading now as a group, we're reading Henry David Thoreau's essay, and it's just, it's a great example of a fact that you can know, right? All American citizens were required to return enslaved people to their enslavers. And then you read Thoreau's essay where he says the people of Concord, the governor of Massachusetts said, send the militia, send this enslaved person back to Kentucky. Then there's an editorial note that the man was publicly whipped. And Thoreau is, you know, pointing his finger at his townspeople, at his fellow Massachusetts residents, and he says, "You know, you did this. You were the people responsible for this man's whipping." So it's pretty powerful stuff. And Josiah Henson got himself all the way to Canada. He started with his children in a sack over his shoulder. And his biography, if you're unfamiliar with it, we love to introduce people to it. It's a slim little volume. It's beautifully written, passionately written. Our colleague Brenna loves to talk about the fact that when he got to Canada, the first thing he did was roll on the ground, roll on the ground, and experience freedom for the first time in his life. It's really quite moving. So Harriet was doing her homework. She was doing her research. Okay, so now we have to talk about this very poignant image that's in the back parlor. Jasmine, do you want to introduce us?
Sure. And I think I really need to talk just really briefly. Harriet, while she is in Cincinnati, she meets her husband, Calvin Stowe, who was a professor of theology at the time. And they have 7 children, so quite the big family. But as many folks are familiar, unfortunately, a lot of big families don't stay big for long. And Harriet does lose 4 of her children before she passes. And the reason we're focusing on this image right here, this is her 6th child, Samuel Charles. And he passes away at only 18 months old because of a cholera outbreak in the city of Cincinnati. And I do, you know, before I get really into the aftermath of Samuel Charles and Harriet's loss, I like to think about this image, because for the longest time I've been moving through the house, talking about Samuel Charles and then moving on. But the other day we were all in the house and we decided to just look a little bit more close at some of these images. And I like to emphasize some of the heavy grief that's in this image. This is a post-mortem photo of Samuel Charles. So it was taken after his death. Harriet, a family friend, a sister, probably had to pose this child in a certain way with the rug on the countertop or wherever they decided, call the photographer, not call at the time, but have someone fetch the photographer to take this image. There's a lot of heaviness surrounding this image. And that heaviness did translate for Harriet. And in this moment where she's angry at God for taking away her son, she's filled with grief over the loss. She can't help but think of those enslaved mothers who are being torn from their children at the auction block. Still, in all of that grief, she makes that connection to the people that were less fortunate than her, these women that are being enslaved. And it's sort of bittersweet that motherhood was really the thing that connected Harriet to these enslaved mothers. And there's a quote here, and I'm not going to read everything that's on the screens, but I really do like to read this quote, because I think you can hear Harriet's phrasing, you can hear her grief, you can hear her loss, where she says, "It was at his dying bed and at his grave that I learnt what a poor slave mother may feel when her child is torn away from her." She says, "At least I know where my son is. I see his grave, but that poor enslaved mother has no idea where her son is." That unknown is definitely still there. And this happens in 1849. Harriet starts penning Uncle Tom's Cabin very soon after. And two of the main characters are a mother and her young son who are going to be torn from each other. Her young son is to be sold away from her. It's Eliza and young Harry. And Harriet is almost sort of consoling herself. It's almost a self-therapy writing about this mother and child that will eventually, escape north to Canada, very similar to Josiah Henson's story.
Mm-hmm. Harriet had been writing in Cincinnati. She joined a literary club called the Semicolon Club. This is where she met Eliza Stowe and her then husband, Calvin Stowe, who Harriet would later marry. And she writes to her sister, it's one of my favorite moments. She writes to her sister and says, "You'll start seeing my name here and there. Make no mistake, I'm doing it for the money." That's a paraphrase, but she's writing to make a few bucks. She's got 6 kids. She has a husband who's not making a lot of money, and she's writing about New England. She's living in the West, and she's writing these sort of sentimental, nostalgic pieces about growing up in Connecticut. And then comes this kind of call to action. She asks her sister-in-law. She's so moved by this memory of this enslaved woman's plight. What can I do? And her sister-in-law immediately responds in a letter. These people wrote letters like nobody's business. She immediately responds, "If I could write as you can write, I would write a novel. I would turn my pen to this question of ending slavery." And that is, it's a beautiful moment where it all kind of clicks together. And that's the sort of the genesis of this novel, which was, as Jasmine said, just a short story she thought to begin with.
Well, and I just quickly want to add on to what you said. I love that quote so much. And my favorite part about that quote is she says, "I would make the whole nation feel what an accursed thing slavery is." Not read about, not think, but feel. And I think that's definitely sort of the little key to understanding Harriet, that we're going to talk about the criticism that she gets for being a heavily emotional writer, and then other folks saying that that was her strength, and that gray area in between. But I just love that word, because that's exactly what Harriet goes on to do. This is the national era, folks. So this is where Uncle Tom's Cabin appears for the very first time. I don't know if you can move your cursor over there where it first says, it appears June 5th, 1851, Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Life Among the Lowly. That is what it's titled right from the get-go. She, however, does not know how long this is going to be. She sells it to the newspaper. "Well, I think, we'll go as long as you need me to go." And you might notice it's a little small and a little blurry, but she does write under Harriet Beecher Stowe. So she's not writing under a male name or a pseudonym. She's writing as Harriet, primarily because her father, Lyman Beecher, was one of the most well-known preachers in the entire country, and so are all of her brothers. So holding on to that Beecher name is what's going to gain her, the recognition that she needs, primarily just for money to feed her family.
And her husband insisted on it. He's like, you keep that Beecher. That Beecher name is essentially money in the bank. And the sales of the newspaper were not enormous, didn't enormously improve. It was recognized, it was known, but it was only when the book came out. This is, as Jasmine mentioned, this is how people like Dickens, Wilkie Collins, it was very typical, George Eliot, that you would serialize. And then eventually, if it was a success, you would have the option to put it in a book. I love the idea that one of the reasons that Harriet could write this novel is that she had to keep writing it. Chapter 1 already existed. The characters were there. They'd been described. and she just had to continue it. I don't how many of our audience members are writers, and the process of rewriting and rethinking and second guessing yourself. Well, when chapter one has already hit the press and it's in everybody's living room, you can't rethink it. You just keep writing it. Something I tell myself when I'm working on a piece of writing. I said, just do it like Harriet. Just get it written. So, as Jasmine mentioned, 30,000 copies in its first year. No one was ready for this. No one expected this. The printer writes to Harriet and says, we have more paper, we print more books. We simply cannot keep the presses running. And these are some of the editions that came out in Harriet's lifetime. And I'm fascinated by book covers. I know a lot of my students never get beyond the cover of the book. So I like to know how much information a book cover can kind of share. It says a lot when here's an edition from, I think this is 1888. This would have been around the time that Chekhov was writing. The Civil War is over, slavery has ended. It's already become a classic. This is another thing I love, that, if you're writing in 1853, who are the great American authors? They're not great yet. Hawthorne is understood to be important, Longfellow, Melville, Poe, but they're not, the great American authors yet. That time has to go by. So Harriet is very much in the running for this. Maybe we'll take a little chat moment. If anybody has any thoughts about this book cover and they want to drop them in the chat, we can see what people are thinking, or kind of any questions at all, maybe up to this point. No? Keeping my eye on that little chat bubble. Okay, well, feel free to drop in as we go along. Any questions or comments? We love them. But Jasmine, you actually were talking about this before we got started tonight. Do you want to share some of the things you noticed about this edition?
I would. It's funny because I've been and thank you so much, Jennifer. We appreciate that. Oh my goodness. And that's a funny question. She's asking Lori was asking who is the illustrator. I'm not sure. And I asked our curator as well who the illustrator was, and she did not know off the top of her head. If there are any other, questions or comments about that, I'm sure we can leave Beth's contact information for folks to contact afterwards.
And we love questions we don't know the answer to. It means we're going to learn.
Yes, because eventually I'll learn the answer to that question. But I love right there in the center. I don't know if anyone really noticed that we have the bird. I'm not sure if it's a dove. I'm really not sure what kind of bird it is. And then we see the sort of olive branch and the chains around it. We typically associate, the bird carrying the olive branch. And I'll get to that question in just a second, but I just think it's a very interesting depiction when it comes to being a book about slavery.
Great.
All right. This isn't about a cover, but what are your thoughts about why this book sold 1 million copies in England and fewer in the US?
1.5.
Yes, 1.5 million. I think number one, population size. America is still an extremely new country at this point. I think Lyman Beecher was born a year before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and that's Harriet's father. So smaller population size. We also have the fact that England abolished slavery already. They are still buying our cotton, right? They're still accepting imports from, enslaved labor in the United States. But I picture it as sort of them watching rats in a cage. What's America going to do next? And the Queen Victoria, loved Uncle Tom's Cabin. So I'm sure hers was a glowing recommendation that people felt they couldn't pass up.
And Harriet was invited to England. Of those 1.5 million copies, Harriet didn't make any money. She didn't make any of the royalties because she didn't own the copyright in England. You had to be on the soil of a foreign country to claim a copyright. And when she did go, they raised what they called a penny campaign. And she was given $10,000 in cash because the British public knew that she hadn't made any money. After that, and I'm trying to get this slide to move ahead here. After that, she would go up to Canada when she published another book, and she would claim the British copyrights. All right, come on.
Technical difficulties bound to happen.
Don't you love them? We were doing so well. There we go. Okay. So we like to take a minute. We always like to sew the past to the present. You know, what's the impact of the novel? Hugely successful book, controversial then, controversial now. Americans are viewing slavery in a different way, and we create icons. These characters, they're in theaters all around the country. People know the story. I'd be curious to know, how many of our listeners tonight have read the novel? How many remember Eva St. Clair, the sort of saintly child, Topsy, the naughty child of African descent? The characters are really boldly drawn. Harriet's life has generated 2 Pulitzer-winning biographies. And as we're sitting here in front of this computer, the conversation goes on today. Jazz, do you want to add anything to that?
I think this novel is really interesting, especially because, it's so easy to look back, on the 19th century and criticize the novel from a perspective from the future. But I think this novel's unique in that those criticisms did exist when Harriet is writing the novel. Oh, perfect. And we'll get to this in a second. Because, the elephant in the room, right? Uncle Tom, the racial slur, Uncle Tom. And so feel free to read through this depiction as I'm talking about this. But we have James Baldwin, who we're going to talk about in the future with a very negative reaction. But we even have Frederick Douglass with some criticisms of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And that's right then in the moment to her doorstep letters. So I think throughout the ages will continuously be arguing, right, about Uncle Tom's Cabin. And I'm lucky enough to work in a place where all of our colleagues are constantly tossing back and forth ideas about where this novel fits in its time period and still today as well. But I really think, we have all of these great characters, as Thomas had mentioned, but the real character that becomes the staple of Uncle Tom's Cabin and this figure for years to come, even today, is Uncle Tom. So take a few minutes to just read through that quote. He was a strong, young Black man in the novel. I don't know, again, how many of you have read the novel or if that was your impression of Uncle Tom. I remember reading it for the first time, and I came to work here and I was shocked that I'm seeing him as an old man, right, in a rocking chair out on the front porch, when that's really not what Stowe described him as.
Let's go to Harriet. I'll read through Harriet's words.
Sure.
He is to be the hero of our story. We must daguerreotype for our readers. He was a large, broad-chested, powerfully made man, characterized by an expression of grave and steady good sense, united with much kindliness and benevolence. There was something in his whole air, self-respecting and dignified, yet united with a confiding and humble simplicity. We could talk for an hour about that description, but what does it conjure up in your mind? Here's one illustrator's rendition. We have it in the archives that we've collected. I would say we, like I had anything to do with this. But there are thousands of depictions of Uncle Tom. But it starts, of course, with Harriet's language.
Cool. And now we really start to get into it here. This image on the left here, this is what Uncle Tom becomes. He really was, there's a lot of religious themes in Harriet's book. Harriet, says herself, I wrote what I did because as a Christian, a mother, a lover of my country. And being a Christian was a very big proponent in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Like Thomas said, we have little Eva, the evangelical Christian. We have Tom, who is supposed to be the Jesus Christ character of the novel. He's the first Black protagonist in an American fiction novel. And it's a very big deal for Harriet to write this character who was supposed to be a hero to Black people at the time. Yet when it's translated into stage and screen, that disappears. Why would we put up this character that Black people are supposed to be proud of? And an age where in a lot of places Black people weren't legally allowed on stage. So a lot of these characters are played in blackface. But along with his aging, you can see right here, this is a very obvious stereotype of a Black man, sitting in his chair out on the lawn. But more than that, they change his character completely. He is now Uncle Tom to be pitied, the Uncle Tom that's kissing up to the white man at the expense of his fellow Black people. And we can even see in that picture on the right, actor in blackface.
So fun but not funny fact that Rodrigo, our colleague, just told me. Katharine Hepburn lived in a house that was on the site of one of Catherine's sister's houses here in Nook Farm. And the first performance that Katharine Hepburn ever gave when she was 8 years old, she played the child Topsy in blackface. So talk about linking, the past and the present. Who knew? Katharine Hepburn is the one to do it. From long enough ago to have lived on the property here at Nook Farm, and to have actually played in blackface here in Connecticut, the character of Topsy. Sort of staggering. But we have hundreds of these souvenir items. Harriet wasn't making a penny off of any of this, but plenty of other people were. This doll on the right is really troubling. It's why don't you talk about it, Jasmine?
Yeah, so this one in particular is a depiction of Topsy and little Eva from Uncle Tom's Cabin. The term was a topsy-turvy doll, and to make it a little bit more modern, I can let folks know that I had one of these growing up, and it was Little Red Riding Hood on one side and the wolf on the other, to switch between the two. But this doll in particular, you can see those caricatures right there on the doll's face. And it's really interesting to me, and I'm happy that we have a doll depiction of something in what's called our impact gallery. So we show the impact of Uncle Tom's Cabin. But it just brings back a memory for me of a young children's book. And I mentioned this on my tours now that I read when I was quite young. It was called Almost to Freedom. And it was about a young girl, enslaved girl, whose mother sews a doll similar to this doll for her. And the book is written from the doll's perspective. And, she's watching, the daughter's mother get beaten. She's watching the little girl get whipped. And then eventually they escape. They escape to freedom. And the doll gets left in a cellar on the Underground Railroad. And she waits there and she waits there. And then a new young girl comes through and takes this doll. And when we think about what were people in enslavement allowed to have, material possessions, it really wasn't much. So it's quite amazing to that duality of a very offensive depiction of a Black character, and also the sentimentality of pieces of cloth sewn together to create this personal and important item to someone. So I love that doll. I think it brings up so many thoughts and feelings for a lot of people.
What's the title of that children's book?
It's called Almost to Freedom, and it is based on a true story. The doll is now sitting, I believe, in the Smithsonian. So yeah,
amazing. I never heard that. I'm glad we can talk together.
Yeah, and it reminds me of my childhood. So I think I like to share that with folks coming to the museum.
So here's just a few more of these. We have a gallery filled with the sort of aftermath from immediately after the book until even more recently than 1947. Depiction, here's another version of Uncle Tom on a playing card. So we really wanted to sort of push the dialogic button here. Jasmine and I, we hate to listen to ourselves. So let's blow up the chat box a little bit. I'd love to just have responses to this particular image. Take a look at it what comes to mind? What do you think? A first response, a question, any kind of a response to this? We're famous on our tours for being smilingly silent till someone of the group talks. So we can give you a moment to chime in. Anything at all that you're processing.
Mm-hmm.
Come along and laugh. Come along and laugh at Uncle Tom's Cabin. I can only imagine. I can't imagine really what Harriet would, how she would respond to an image like this.
Mm-hmm.
But images can take many forms, one book, many responses.
Mm-hmm.
And we wanted to just take a minute to kind of review some of the comments. Why don't we take these back and forth, Jasmine? Do you want to read the first one?
Sure, absolutely. 100 years after Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, the poet Langston Hughes called the novel the most cussed and discussed book of its time.
Notice he doesn't give his own opinion.
No, very short and to the point.
George Orwell calls it the best bad book of the age.
Oh yes, and let me just move some of these around here. It's blocking the screen for me. Leo Tolstoy is one of the few critics who praised it unabashedly, calling Uncle Tom's Cabin a model of the highest type of art because it flowed from love of God and man. So why has it been called a verbal earthquake, an ink and paper tidal wave?
Whenever we have Russian visitors to the house, they've always read the book. Not, I don't think because of Leo Tolstoy, I think because of Karl Marx. But it's fascinating. Everyone in Russia seems to have read Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Mm-hmm.
In the 20th century, Malcolm X suggested that it wasn't radical enough, claiming that Martin Luther King was a modern Uncle Tom who was doing the same thing today to keep Negroes defenseless in the face of an attack. That's hard to read. That's a tough phrase to read. But there are moments in the book that are tough to read. Tom is sold several times, and his response at one point is, "God's will be done, Master." He's this pious, God-fearing person of African descent, and he sort of accepts his lot. And you can imagine being an African American in 1959, reading that and wanting to throw the book across the room. Where were the items produced? All the items that we're showing here were produced in America. There was wallpaper was produced in Australia. Many things were made in England, but all the things that we showed you tonight were produced here.
Yeah, I believe those ceramics of Eliza and Harry, I believe those are Staffordshire. I'm almost positive. All right. Oh, it's just being a little slow.
I'm clicking. I don't know why.
Oh, in the north or the south were those items produced? I think it varied, and you can sort of tell, right? Some of these heavily caricaturized images of Tom, and particularly Tom and little Eva, those were heavily produced in the South to warn people about the predatory actions of Black men with young white children, right? And so they were really produced to get people angry at Uncle Tom's Cabin, Uncle Tom, Black people in general, really leaning into those stereotypes that still unfortunately continue today.
And we'll just share this quickly. James Baldwin wrote a whole essay about Uncle Tom's Cabin. And we love him. He does not mince his words. Uncle Tom's Cabin's like its multitudinous hard-boiled descendants is a catalog of violence. This is explained by the nature of Mrs. Stowe's subject matter, her laudable determination to flinch from nothing in presenting the complete picture, an explanation which falters only if we pause to ask whether or not her picture is indeed complete. He calls it, or elsewhere, he calls it a very bad novel. So this is tough to see. Jasmine and I were processing this earlier. Did Harriet ever comment on the pictures or covers that were so derogatory of Uncle Tom? Not anything that I've read. No, she didn't comment on the illustrations. And most of what we're seeing came afterwards. And actually, we know that she avoided the theater. She only went to one theatrical performance ever. She was, raised in a strictly Calvinist household. The theater is not where she was going to go. She certainly didn't have these Tomitudes around her house. Her favorite art object that we have in the house is a French sculpture it's called The African Woman at the Well. I just found out there's another one by the same sculptor is in the Louvre. So we have it right here in Hartford. It's a beautiful piece of art. The style of these Tomitudes, this sort of tchotchke-like style, that's not what you see in Harriet's house. It's a very, very refined, quiet kind of decor. But here's Uncle Tom, in our own backyard. Uncle Obama's cabin. We couldn't decide what to say about this, so maybe we're not going to say anything. Just let it speak for itself.
Yeah. I mean, I think also the silence is very powerful when confronted with an image like this.
And it's not
I was going to say, if anyone does have any thoughts and wants to put that in the chat, that's more than welcome.
Why my computer has taken on a mind of its own. In any case, I think we're just at about our 45 minutes. And I know we want to be sure to open the conversation to questions.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I guess I'll just briefly talk about, while you're figuring out the slideshow, really bringing it into the modern day, right? Right here. Just gonna move this around here. We see Larry Elder, definitely been in the media a lot recently. But this is from a movie, a documentary that was created called Uncle Tom. And it featured a lot of very prominent Black Republicans. And it was very interesting. On our tour, we are a historic house museum, right? We get visitors that are Republican, Libertarian, Democrat, extremely liberal, all across the spectrum. And I really think it's important to talk about this, because what is an Uncle Tom? Someone that maybe falls out of the bubble of what a Black person should be, but what should a Black person be? And this is a question I'm continuously asking myself. And in the same way that a lot of modern day young Black folks have reclaimed the N-word, similar with gay people reclaiming the F-word, right? These words that used to be derogatory towards people are now reclaiming it as a sense of power. Young Black conservatives are trying to reclaim the term Uncle Tom, bringing it back to the original description in the book. So, whatever your beliefs are and thoughts about that or opinions are, I think it's definitely happening now, right in our backyard. Anytime you turn on the news, Uncle Tom this, Uncle Tom that. So I just invite folks to keep an eye out for that and really think about the origins of Uncle Tom's Cabin the next time you hear that phrase being thrown about. I think it's really a way that you can connect with the modern political climate, no matter what side of the aisle you are on.
And as I said, we always try to bring Harriet into the present day. It's one of the pleasures of having a conversational style tour. Different people have different lived experiences, different opinions. And we have these conversations in Harriet Beecher Stowe's front parlor. which is where, civil society gathered together in her lifetime, and he talked about the news of the day. Well, we try to recreate exactly that here. So I'm going to kind of blow through this because guess what? We talk too much, Jasmine.
I know.
But Stowe, separating families. Does that sound like a contemporary issue, or is it only an issue from the 19th century? Scenes of blood and cruelty are shocking to our ear and our heart. Humanity comes out in a variety of strange forms. There's no end to the odd things humane. That's a Flannery O'Connor quote. The things people will do. The past and the present. She is. I love these younger pictures of her.
Yeah, a lot of them are her when she's quite old. So I encourage you to look up some younger pictures of Harriet.
Before she was an elder stateswoman. So here's the question that we ask on every tour. Harriet said, what can I do? And we ask our visitors, what can you do? And I know, being a library crowd, you're going to agree. One thing you can do is read. Learn from history. Prepare for action. The books that are out now, so many wonderful books, so many different perspectives, so much background insight. Think creatively, think imaginatively. I know I don't need to tell you why you read, but all of these themes are really, really central to Harriet's life and work.
I'm thinking right now, after this has already been put together, that I would even add a third one on there, to escape, right? I mean, I think we're all so engaged in the world and what's going on right now. Sometimes it is okay to need to, escape to a book, just to take a break. We all need breaks from, being warriors for justice sometimes. And I know, definitely working at the Stowe Center, I do as well. So I think reading is just this whole multitude of things that we can do for ourselves, for our brains, intellectually, and also health-wise.
And if you're looking for a good book, we highly recommend Dr. Clint Smith's book, How the Word is Passed. Every year, the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center awards the Stowe Prize to a book that deals with social justice. And this was this year's winner. It's a wonderful book. It's a documentary about his visits to sites of conscious, museums that deal with the history of African-American enslavement and how the museums interpret it. And he goes into real depth into the thinking that goes into the presentations by the docents, how the public receives it, how that dialogue goes forward. And he speaks very eloquently about his own life. And we had the pleasure of spending a day with him. He came for our great festival, our awards dinner, and then the next day he was here on the campus for the whole day and spoke with us. Do you want to share anything about that, Jasmine?
It was amazing, and I think it was really nice for me as a tour guide to speak with him, and hearing him say, leading with empathy, just made me jump up and down and scream for joy, because that's what I try to do on my tours. Bring it back to my earlier point of, we get visitors of all different types, all different political beliefs, all different races, and being able to open myself up to someone who I might not necessarily agree with on the surface level, and lead with empathy and ask them for their story, because every single person that comes to our museum believes something because of something that they saw or something that happened to them or an experience they have had. So being able to open myself up, someone says something on the surface that might seem really offensive, but putting that to the side for a second and asking them why did you say this? I want to know more about you. It was really validating for me as a guide to really be able to talk to him and experience what he is trying to, put out into the museum world. So it was one of the best days of my museum life, definitely.
It's a terrific book and very much a snapshot of America today. Gail had a question that often comes up on a tour, where Josiah Henson has this experience that Harriet very much capitalizes on. He had published his own autobiography She didn't directly give him money, but in the second edition of his autobiography, it says this is the story on which Uncle Tom's Cabin was based.
Mhm.
So he did gain notoriety from that. And then the story gets crazy because he goes to the Crystal Palace, the great exhibit in London, and he doesn't portray, he assumes the identity of Uncle Tom. And he sets himself up there. They have a little set for him to live on. He
Yeah.
engages with the public. And he is, and 1.5 million copies are sold. And here he is, come and meet Uncle Tom.
Mhm.
And so Harriet wasn't paying him to do that, but he was making money doing it. Harriet shared some of the money, but it was not the primary focus of her income, was not given to abolitionism. Calvin, one of my favorite letters from Calvin, where he says, you owe it to God, to me, and to the American public to account for every penny of this money, which she was always kind of unable to do. It was dreadful. All right. The last picture is a picture of the house. We want you to come and see us. I can't get my slides to move. I'm going to stop sharing. And let's open it up to any questions or comments or thoughts.
All right.
You are able to unmute yourselves now if you'd like to ask a question out loud.
No? Are we good? Maybe we're good?
Mariana, do you have a question?
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks. All right. Well, come and see us.
Yes, please do. We would love to see all of you coming through the house and continuing this conversation. You're all experts now, so.
Yes, right? Well, I have nothing to tell you. All right. And come prepared to ask questions. We love them.
Mhm.
All right. Kirsty, over to you then, I think.
All right, thank you so much, Jasmine and Thomas. It was a great presentation. You guys are great speakers. I hope to have you guys here in the future. Thank you everyone for coming, and have a good night.
Okay. Thanks.